All right. Let's go back and summarize verses 1 through 7. I'll first give you my translation of it that we had last week. For I will, and it's not the auxiliary verb will, it's the intent of the mind. So that's the intent of the mind. And it's from Thello. Okay, from Thello. All men to be as also I myself am. But each man has his own gift from God, and this is out of God. The gift emanates with God, comes from God. One indeed after this manner, one after that manner. Okay. All right. Now, let's summarize. I think I did this last week, but let's go back to it one quick time. Verses 1 through 7, marriage during periods of persecution is permitted, but it's unwise. In other words, the advice is don't do it because of the troubles you're going to have. Marriage, even during persecution, is better than committing fornication by far. And couples may or are permitted to refrain from conjugal relations if it's by mutual consent and for spiritual reasons. And in this context, I think there would be other reasons, such as illness or other things of that nature. Okay, if one member were put into prison for being a Christian, I believe that would be a justifiable reason. Of course, it would be obvious it couldn't occur. But the period of refraining, this voluntary refraining, and is to be brief and must be by mutual consent. That is, both agreeing to the act of refraining from conjugal relations. Right. The fourth thing we learned is Paul desired that all Christians have the continency or the self-control, the ability to control themselves that would enable them to live in celibacy in such times as the present distress. However, in normal times, we can see this from Hebrews 13:4, that Paul desired Christians to marry and raise a family. Any questions? Comments? All right. Now, let's go with verse 8. Start with it. And I'll start with James. Can you do this one for us? Start us off.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Just a minute, please. Lego de tois, agamois, kaitais, kairais, kalon, autois, hestin, eon, menosin, hos, kago. And 7 verse 8, just a minute, please. Almost there. Okay, I translated that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them to remain even as I.
Okay. And so the King James said, if they remain, the American Standard. And of course, aeon is if. And it's a hypothetical if. Okay. And it'll go with the subjunctive mood aeon normally does. Okay, to the unmarried. Now, he says unmarried and widows. Are widows unmarried?
Widows are not married.
They're unmarried. They're not married. So he is distinguishing them as a separate group. And this might be unmarried here, might include bachelors and women who have never married. And it might include men who are widowers, or it might include someone who's scripturally divorced. Okay, does that make sense? But he classifies the widows as a separate group, probably because he's going to deal with them a little bit later. Okay, now according to Thayer, Agamos is, of course, it is a privative on it here, and it's gamos to be married, gamos, and then alpha privative, not married. All right. Now, what we have here is we have another word that is sometimes commonly said, where Greeks commonly said, and this is andros, and this is a movable nu, and so we have andros, man, and the alpha privative for it. And so that would be not having a man. That would be a woman who's not married. But he said that word is sometimes used. Agamos, I think, is probably including both men and women. Whereas this andros, anandros, two alphas together couldn't go together, so it's a movable nu there. That's negating a man, not having a man, right? Unmarried men, word found here and in verse 11, 32, and 34. And so this is plural, masculine plural, but it might include women too, as a generic statement. But we know it definitely includes men, bachelors, men who've never been married. And bachelors might be included in the word virgins. The later section of this chapter. Widowers, men whose wives have died, and men who are scripturally divorced. I would say it includes that. So he gives them permission to marry. And so if he gives them permission in verse 9, we're going to see verse 9 down here. And if he gives them permission, then I would argue that they're not unscripturally divorced persons, because he couldn't give them permission to marry. Now, if you assume this is referring to unscripturally divorced people, you're saying he's given them permission to marry. And of course, that's an assumption. You have to assume this is unscripturally divorced people. But if they don't have permission to marry, if they're unscripturally divorced, then this could not apply to them. Any questions or comments? I would argue this, and you have to think about this yourself, but my conclusion is this. The word married has two basic meanings. First of all, it has the meaning in the eyes of God, and second, in the eyes of men, and they may not be the same meaning. All right, let me illustrate this. The world uses the word baptized with one meaning, and God has another meaning. Does that make sense? Baptized is an immersion, according to the scriptures, according to God's view, whereas the world may define it somewhat differently. Now, the same thing would happen with married. If I were to claim I was married to somebody, that doesn't make me married. Just saying it to be the case. Two men marrying one another here in the United States, which was unheard of when I was younger, is now the thing being pushed by a good portion of our society. That's how evil we've become. But right here, what we have is the claim that they're married in God's eyes is, I think, somewhat almost ridiculous to claim that God accepts their marriage. So I would say some people are not married in God's eyes, but they are in the eyes of men. But God never joined them together. And so I would say that if God didn't join them and he doesn't give them permission to marry, then their marriage is a sham. It's not a marriage in God's eyes. Maybe in man's eyes, but man's eyes don't count when it comes to the judgment day. Any questions? So a person who divorced their mate for unscriptural reasons other than fornication doesn't have the right to remarry. Okay. Now, and so they would not fit in this category of being given permission to marry in verse 9. The widows is someone who is barren. The Greek word means someone who's sterile or barren. And this would be someone who's like a land that's barren, like a desert. And so she has no one to care for her. Now, in the United States in modern times, widows will have something like Social Security and other things they can support themselves, and a woman can get a pretty good job. Whereas back then, there was not much work they could do. So it was very, very much harder for women back then than it is today. And so we have this instructions to widows here. It's a narrow group than the men, because he deals with unmarried women who were virgins in the later section of this chapter. So I think he's setting forth the fact that widows are in this group as well, but he doesn't deal with unmarried women that are not widows. I think he deals with them in the later verses. A widow will have special problems. She was not able to get herself a job very easily, had difficulty supporting herself. Women living alone, it's a dangerous situation. Paul gives instruction on the support of widows by their families and by the church in 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16. Now, in my book, The Role of Women, the combined volume, I have a whole chapter on that. And if you want that information, you let me know if you don't already have it, and I'll send it to you. But it lays out my views of 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 6. But I say to the unmarried, to the widows, it is good, and it's kalon, or kalos from kalos, and it's whole, or has all its parts in the right proportion, right? It's harmonious and complete for them. If, this is a conditional word, aeon, and it always goes with the moods of uncertainty, and that would be the subjunctive mood. Right? If they abide, so this will be a subjunctive mood verb. If they may abide, even as I am, even as I. Right. Now, Paul was single and was advising him to remain single, and only for the time of the present distress. And we have to go to verse 36 as a qualifying word or expression for this context. So this is part of our context. So I'm going to go ahead and read verse 26. I think, or I deem, we'll get to the word think later. Therefore, that this is good by reason of the distress that's upon us, namely that it's good for a man to be as he is. So there's a present distress, I believe the King James reads, that's upon us, so that this present distress. And so this is probably persecution that was about to come. And let me illustrate this. A man who loved his wife and or children, if he saw them being tortured, it would be harder for him to resist it than maybe himself being tortured. If they were torturing my little 5-year-old son or daughter and trying to get me to deny Christ, that would be harder to me, at least, than it would if they were torturing me, I think. I really think it would. And probably most of you would agree with me. So I say to the unmarried, I translated it, I say the unmarried, and I put men in italics because it's masculine gender, to the widows, and these would be women. It is good for them if they abide, even as I, and I put abide in italics. Questions or comments about how I translated it? Anything you want to add there, James, since you were translating it and dealing with this?
No, I don't know that it was mentioned. You had mentioned the person that unscripturally divorced someone that they did not have a right to marry. The person that they've divorced unscripturally would also not have a right to remarry, correct?
I believe so.
Okay, I just don't know that that was said, but that struck me as you were going through.
I,
I think,
I believe you're right.
okay,
Right. Now, let me say this. If I divorced my wife for I was burning the bread, then I went out and married another woman, I think I would be committing fornication. And that might give her grounds to remarry. That would be a question. That would be another question. What I did, I could divorce and then run off and start committing fornication with someone. So that's another question there. Okay. Yep.
okay.
All right. Now let's go to verse 9 if we can. Chris, can you do this one? Shane, will you be able to do 10? Are you up on it when we get to it?
I will not be able to.
Okay. Okay, we'll go back. We'll skip you then. Okay, go ahead. Jerry's not going to be with us tonight. Go ahead there, Chris, if you would.
Okay. Egg kara tu ontai. Let's see. Gam sato son. Corazon gar esten. Gemesai a. Poro. See. Porosthai. I have, but if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn.
All right. But see, now notice the contrast. If they don't have self-control, King Mark Standard says continency, but this is self-government or self-control. All right. And the word's only found here and in 1 Corinthians 9:25. It's only found 2 places. And it's middle passive form. What voice did you determine it to be?
Well, this would be middle, that control themselves.
Yeah, that's what I believe. I believe you're correct. All right. Then he says, let them marry. And here the imperative mood can be a permission. It can be permission. I command them to have permission to marry. He's not commanding them to go ahead and marry. But I think he's saying here now, if you can't contain yourself, then you better marry. It comes close to commanding them, though, doesn't it? Because it is imperative mood. And it's better off to marry than to what?
Burn.
To burn. Now, this burning is interesting here. Some take it to be burning in hell, and some take it to be burning with lust. So those are 2 possible explanations. All right. And remember, this is from Agathos, Crason, and it's an irregular adjective, okay? All right, so it has a different form, like good, better, best in English. And to marry is, of course, an infinitive, an aorist infinitive, not continually marrying over and over, but it's viewing it as one time. Of course, the aorist doesn't necessarily mean it's a one-time act, but it is viewed that way. That's what you want to remember. So the burning. So what did you think it was? What kind of burning do you think it was? Is it burning with lust or is it burning in hell?
I'm leaning towards lust myself, but I could see either one going, because it does have an actual burning there with a literal, but it's spiritual bodies, isn't it? At that point, if you're talking about if you're talking about after judgment, and it is described as a lake of fire. So I don't know. Since he's talking to the Christians there, I kind of lean more towards burning with lust.
That's my view. but I wouldn't get in a fuss with someone if they said it was hell. Okay.
Mhm.
It's one of those things that I don't think we can know for sure, but I'm convinced it's probably burning with lust. James, you got anything to add, or Shane? One of you guys got anything to add there?
Not me. I'm of the same opinion. Could go either way. I can't be dogmatic.
No.
Well, to burn with lust and not repent of it would lead to burning in hell.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so, it's kind of like with the destruction of Jerusalem sometimes, where that eventually, sadly, those, who were destroying the destruction of Jerusalem, who were disobedient, will end up going to hell, like Matthew 3:11 with the fire.
Yeah.
So, I see. That's the way I view it.
All right. Okay. So it's one of those things. I think it's foolish to get in an argument and to have ill feelings over interpretation of something like that, because as Shane pointed out, if you can't control yourself and you burn with lust and sin, you're going to wind up in hell unless you repent and correct it. Okay, so it's okay. So I think it's because of the context. I think it's probably burning with lust. Okay, all right, but that's a little more figured out. Although I really think hell is, in my view, is not a literal fire. It's probably figurative for an awful, terrible, painful situation, and it's pain for the spirit. And it's probably worse. I think burning is one of the most painful things we can have, and he's using that to tell us hell will be an awful place. And whether it be literal fire or not, I wouldn't debate that issue, but I'm satisfied it's going to be an awful, painful situation. And that's what he's trying to convey to us. That's what my view is. Any questions there? All right, verse 8, Romans 3:8, and why not, as we are slanderously reported to some affirm, we say, let us do evil that good may come, whose condemnation is just. Paul did not say you could do evil that good would come. In this case, he's not saying you can divorce for other than fornication and remarry because you're lusting. And I've heard people to say that, and they tried to accuse Paul of teaching that here. So I'll bring this up for that reason. Any questions or comments? All right. And so my argument is if divorcing for other than fornication and remarrying is a sin, then Paul did not get permission to divorce for other than fornication in 1 Corinthians 7:9. Second point, if marrying after divorce for other than fornication is sin, then Paul did not give permission to remarry after divorce for other than fornication. I would argue this, that he did not set aside something else and say you can sin that good would come. And that's basically what we run into. In order to use this passage to prove that one can divorce or remarry for cause other than fornication, he must prove that there are other scriptural grounds for divorce and remarriage. And I haven't seen anything even close to proof that there's any other scriptural grounds. All right. I just don't think they can show it. It follows that any claim in this passage justifies divorce, remarriage rather than fornication. It begs the question. It assumes what it's trying to prove. And you can't do that. So that's a fallacy. It's a very common fallacy. Here, freely, it says, an argumentation debate. That was my textbook whenever I took that class. One of the most common fallacies of evidence is the use of unsupported assertion. Here, the speaker offers no evidence to support the statement, just asserts it, say, rather than he or she asks us to assume that something is so because he or she says it so. Because that begs the question. I always illustrate it this way. I beg you to allow me to assert this without you questioning it. That's kind of my way of remembering what it is. Just take my word for it. All right. And agree with me, even though I haven't proven it. here's the logical argument that follows this thing. All those with the apostolic permission to marry are those who marry without sin. I believe that's true. Those of 1 Corinthians 7, 8 through 9 are those with the apostolic permission to marry. I believe that's true. Therefore, conclusion, those of 1 Corinthians 7, 8 through 9 are those who marry without sin, including adultery, including the sin of adultery. So if it's a matter of adultery for marrying without your mate having committed fornication, I believe even if your mate commits fornication, you may not have scriptural grounds if you caused it by withholding your body or drove that person away. So I believe you have to be innocent in yourself. Even that person who claims he's innocent, he must be innocent. He must not have caused it to happen. Otherwise, we have two guilty parties and nobody can divorce. They need to stay together and reconcile and straighten out their problems. And does anybody just take issue with that? Okay. Here's another argument that clarifies the limits of this passage. All right, I would say those of 1 Corinthians 7, 8 to 9, those who marry without sin, they're not committing adultery, so it doesn't include that group. If those of 1 Corinthians 7, 8 to 9 marry without sin, then they do not violate any scripture limits who may marry and divorce, who may divorce and remarry. And of course, those of 1 Corinthians 7 marry without sin, and they do not violate any scripture limits who may divorce and remarry. So that's my argument. So any claim that this gives us another grounds for divorce is just fallacious. Adultery in Mark 10:11 is against the mate, right? But adultery is a violation of the marriage covenant. And so if we say this, and he saith unto him, whosoever put his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her. So if he's put her away and they're not married anymore, it wouldn't be adultery because adultery is against the marriage. If I'm not married anymore, it won't be adultery. Not that it would be a sin. It could be a sin. But right here, marrying another amounts to committing adultery against that first person. Well, I would argue then if it's adultery, he has to still be married to her. So God doesn't recognize what I call an unscriptural divorce. He doesn't recognize it. He says you're still married because he calls it adultery. That's my claim. Any questions or comments? If God,
yes, I agree with what you're saying. The question I have is, what if a person is married to somebody and then they discover that they had hidden a divorce that they had had, an unscriptural divorce?
well, did God recognize their marriage?
I would say no.
I would say no too. We had a situation here in the congregation locally several years ago. Young lady married a young man and found out he was still married. He was from Mexico and he had a wife in Mexico. So he's bigamous, and so she divorced him and basically claimed that the marriage was null because he had no right to marry. And I feel she was okay in doing it. That was our situation. Any comments or questions there?
Going back to your terminology that you used, in the eyes of God, in the eyes of man, I understand I understand what you're saying by that, but I try to use the exact scriptural type terminology if it's possible. And I think about Romans 7 using the word bound and deo and of course married, gameo. And I just how can I say this? Like I'll give you an example of this. So this preacher who was once sound, he went off on various doctrines, and one of them was marriage, divorce, remarriage. And he had a wife who committed adultery against him. So he did have the right to put her away for fornication. And then she got remarried. So of course she was living in adultery. And he asked me the question, how is she committing adultery against me? You know, from that Mark 10 passage there. And I had to think about that. And that's where I think this language of that she's still bound to him, even though she's married to someone else, even though it's not right for her to be married, so to speak. Am I making sense with that? Or I'm just trying to
Well, the problem is, and she has an oath, a vow, and she hasn't kept that vow. And I believe sometimes we can lose rights by our sins.
mm-hmm.
For instance, I might lose the right, and I'll illustrate it with civil right. I might lose the right in Oklahoma to vote because I become a felon. And we can do the same thing. I think we lose some rights sometimes. And God still recognizes, I think marriage is a covenant, a three-way covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And the covenant is between the man and the woman and God.
Yes.
And I think it's a diatheke covenant, which is a covenant that a superior being,
mm-hmm.
superior determines all the conditions, and the inferiors have to submit to the conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So God does not give permission to divorce. And so the person who violates that then loses their rights under that covenant. And the one that was innocent, they have the right to go on and remarry. That's my conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be like in a treaty between two nations. One nation may violate the treaty and they may lose rights. What's going on in Ukraine and Russia is debatable, but there's two sides to the story, but I was going to assume that Russia has violated a treaty they made, and I believe they did make an agreement at one time with Ukraine. And if they did, what they've done is violated that agreement. And they might have repercussions lasting beyond the end of the war, so assuming Ukraine wins. Okay. So that could have repercussions. I see it there. I think there's an implication there. It's a three-way covenant, and you're bound to your covenant with God, and you've broken it, and so you have consequences that may go beyond it. She has lost her right to be married to that first husband because he's married someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So she's lost that right, but that doesn't mean she's still not obligated to that covenant which she's broken. That's my view. Anybody else? Any other comments?
I know we've. Well, go ahead.
Go ahead and finish out. I've got a question on a slightly different one, so finish.
Well, I was going to open up this to the class since I've talked to Marion about it, but one of the two marriage divorce questions I've had is, I mean, we've always said who may marry, and that is one who's single, who's never married, one who's divorced their spouse for fornication, who is the innocent party, and of course one whose spouse has died. But my question would be, with regards to Romans 7, if the first spouse died, like the situation I was telling you about, does that lady now have the right to remarry since the original spouse died? And I know she would have to repent, but that's one thing that's plagued me about that. So does anybody have any answers, biblical answers for that? I would love to hear it.
That is a tough question. I would say that because she, you could argue that she comes under the heading that her husband has died, but my idea is probably she doesn't have the right to remarry. I think she may lose that right. Assuming she's unscripturally divorced to begin with. I'm assuming that you're talking about a woman that unscripturally divorces her husband, or she's guilty of fornication and he divorces her. I think that was our first illustration.
Yeah.
It's the case. She just might have forfeited her right to ever remarry. That's my conclusion. That's probably the case.
Okay, I do have a question in a different vein, if I may.
Okay.
Under the old law, a woman could not return to her husband, correct?
If he married someone else.
Yeah, or he or she went off, married somebody else, and then the situation arose where either their spouse died or they got divorced or whatever. And now, let's say the woman wants to return to her original husband. Yeah, whatever's true of the lesser is true of the greater, unless there's an exception stated. Would she be able then to return to her husband, especially in a situation where she was originally bound to him and was viewed as still being bound? So there's a couple of different angles here.
Yeah, we get into all kinds of complicated situations here. I'll be real honest. That's I have some difficulty with it, but I don't think she has a right to marry him again if he's already been married. I think that principle from the Old Testament probably would still apply. I realize, although it's Old Testament law, it's a problem. Okay. But now what's true of the lesser is true of the greater. But what's not true of the lesser is not necessarily not true of the greater. So it doesn't work that way. So you don't take a negative and make it and thrust it. So if it's true that an animal is to be cared for, that you can care for your animals on the Sabbath day, then Jesus can heal a man or a woman on the Sabbath day. But if Jesus can't heal a man or a woman, what's not true of the greater is not true of the lesser from our principles of logic. So we could not say, if it's not true that they could care for the animals, that Jesus couldn't care for the woman or the man. That wouldn't necessarily follow, because what's not true for the lesser is not necessarily not true of the greater, right? And so it's not true that a lesser person has to be married to be a member of the church, but it is true that an elder has to be married to be a member, to be an elder. Does that make sense? So
yes, it does.
So and of course in logic, what's a fortiori is what's true of the lesser, true of the greater. And with what's called contraposition, you negate and reverse them. So what's not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. So God does not require more or less. He doesn't require less of, say, elders than he does other members. So they don't get off easier than the other members, because the elder is a member, of course. I'm just using the elders and the members to illustrate. That's what I'm trying to do here. So we can't say just because she's not allowed to remarry under the law of Moses that she's necessarily not allowed to remarry under the New Testament, because the law of Moses is a lesser covenant. So I wouldn't say that would necessarily follow from our principles of logic. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. I know this is a tough situation here. I realize that. I think we really ought to be looking at Matthew 19, Matthew 5, and other passages like Mark 10, and look at them in context and back up and see what the law of Moses was really saying. And perhaps we can do that a little bit later and deal with that. Maybe we could do that even as a special class or something. Okay. A person who withholds his or her body from her mate, his or her mate, might be guilty of contributing to the sin of the mate by causing the mate to stone. Happened, 1 Corinthians 18:7, and 1 Corinthians 7:2 and 7:5 as well. And so we could do that. And if we cause them to stumble, how can we claim we're innocent? I think the party who divorces better be innocent. If they're not innocent, they have no grounds in my judgment. That's my understanding of the scriptures. Any comments or questions there? I heard of a woman that says, well, I just didn't sleep with him for a couple of years and he finally committed fornication, so I divorced him. And I thought, well, you idiot. Don't you realize you were sinning all that time? I just told her so too. I didn't call her an idiot, but I thought it, first thing I thought was, how ridiculous is your thinking? Okay. You can't cause someone else to sin and then claim you're innocent. All right. All right. This passage is referring to unmarried and to widows, and I think the unmarried is masculine gender, because no, that's true. It probably refers to men, bachelors, widowers, and those who are scripturally divorced. And of course, the widows refers to women whose husbands have died. Well, and on verses 39 and 40, we're looking at that as well. Right? Now, my notes on 1 Timothy 5, and if you have my book on the role of women, I have devote a whole chapter to this and discuss it in some great detail. So you can get my notes on that. If you don't have the book, let me know and I'll send it to you. Okay, electronic copy of it. In Acts 6, 1 through 6, we have widows that were by the church, and they were being cared for. James 1:27. We have more information about treatment of widows by the Lord's people. Now, I think sometimes some of these obligations are individual and some are collective for the church, and we need to be careful we don't get these two mixed up. Okay. Any questions? Paul.
Yes, I do. I'm sorry. I do have a question. The unmarried, you said it was masculine, and so it referred to the men, that sort of thing.
As I said, it might be generic and include, sometimes the masculine would include both genders. But
that's what I was gonna ask about. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, but I think it could possibly include both, but I know for sure it's masculine, and so I've taken it to be limited to the men. The reason I've done that is because he does deal with unmarried women in the following verses and widows later. He separates them out as separate groups. So it'd be redundant if he was including them here. That's why I've gone with it being just bachelors, widowers, and scripturally divorced men, not women. That's my reasoning for it. Other questions? Now we come to a new thought in it. Paul's counsel or advice for the church relating to marriage and celibacy. Again, I really don't think this is dealing with divorce and remarriage or marriage so much as it is celibacy. And the background of this is, as we saw in 26, a situation where they were under the current distress, or this present distress, this persecution. So his advice to the church relating to marriage and celibacy, I think he's answering another question. And so we have a series of questions being asked. And whenever we look at the answers, we can kind of figure out what the question was probably being answered, because the answer we get to it. So I would say the question is probably something like, are Christians required to divorce their unbelieving mates? I think there's another problem occurring in the church here. It's likely that the Judaizers taught this doctrine. Why would they teach it? Well, based upon their views of the law of Moses in the Old Testament, a priest could not be married to someone who was not a Jew, not an Israelite. They couldn't be married to a non-Israelite. And they couldn't even marry a divorced woman, okay? So there were limits upon them that wasn't upon the other people of the children of Israel. And that's found in Ezra 10. We see them actually having to sever their marriages with non-Jewish women in Ezra 10, 1 through 4, even if they had children. So I would encourage you to go back and read that and see kind of a background. Now, the Judaizers could easily have been picking up on something like this and the other things that went along with it, the regulations that were being violated in Ezra 10. And that's why he appears to deal with that question here. All right, let's go back to, let's see, we have Chris. Back to Chris, I guess. Chris, can you read this for us? Translate it for us and read it Greek and translate.
Sure. Tois de gegamekosin para gelo uk ego o kurio gunika apo andros me choristhenai. I have but to the ones married, not I, but the Lord, give this charge that the wife not depart from her husband.
All right. So to the ones that are married. Now, let's look at this word married. It is a participle, but it's a perfect participle. Now, what does the perfect tense tell us? Can you help us, somebody? What can we see?
Completed action.
Completed action and continued results.
Yes.
Okay, so they were married and they still are married. Does that make sense? Those that are married and so it stands alone according to Summers, and English doesn't have a corresponding tense adequate for expressing the significance. So this is the Greek tense of completed action with the resulting state of being. So a state of being. The primary emphasis on the resulting state of being. And three ideas: progress, coming upon a culmination, and completed result. Thus, it implies a process that looks upon the process of having reached consummation, existing as a completed state. I think this is probably, when he says unmarried to the married, I think he's now getting away. He's dealing with, of course, it is masculine, but I think probably here it refers to both men and women. So he gets away from separate them out. All right. And so it's likely referring to both men and women. They're married, they have been married, and still are married. All right. So that would leave out someone who's a widower or a widow. Does that make sense? So someone who's in a state of marriage, they were in the past and they still are. So he said, I'm going to them, talk about them rather than those who are maybe widows and widowers and so forth, or scripturally divorced even. I give charge. So this is among command or ordered. And Thayer says it's from an order of a military commander. And I don't know, James, you weren't in the military, were you, at one time, were you?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, the order comes from the headquarters and goes down the ranks. Okay. And so that's kind of an order we have here. We've all worked for situations where we have bosses that have bosses over them, probably. That's the same situation. So I don't have to be in the military to see that chain of command, if you want to call it that. So he says, I give charge. And then he says, yea, not I. See, not I, but what?
The Lord.
Now, what's he saying here? Is he saying, I'm not commanding this, but the Lord does, or is he saying, this is something that the Lord said and taught while he's here on the earth? You know, there are things the Lord taught that were here upon the earth that are still here for us today, of course, because they're timeless principles. But there's some matters he didn't talk about, some things he didn't tell us or didn't speak to the church about or to the apostles about. Let's look at John 16:12-15 and see what I'm talking about here. I have yet many things to say unto you, but you cannot bear them now. So I have a bunch of things I need to tell you, but you're not able to bear them. See, there's some things I haven't told you yet, see. Howbeit, see, when he, the Spirit of truth, has come, he shall guide you into all the truth. So he's going to give you all these things that you can't bear right now. Think of some things that they couldn't bear. I'll give you one right quick. Do you think with Peter's reaction in Acts 10 to the vision, it had to be let down 3 times to him, that they couldn't bear the idea of Gentiles coming in on equality with the Jews? I think that may have been one of the things they couldn't bear. All right. So there are things they couldn't bear. And so I think they couldn't fathom just yet even the nature of the kingdom not being a physical kingdom. Because even the apostles were still wanting to know if he's going to restore the kingdom to Israel at that time in Acts 1. And so they had to get all of these false ideas out of their mind. And this would include such things as marriage, divorce, or remarriage. Okay, some of the principles there. So he says, you can't bear them now, but the Spirit of truth, that's the Holy Spirit, when he is come, he shall guide you into all the truth. For he shall not speak for himself, but what things soever he shall hear, these shall he speak, and he shall declare unto you things that are to come. He's going to tell you all about these things that you're kind of fuzzy on right now. He shall glorify me, for he shall take mine and declare it unto you. All things whatsoever the Father hath are mine, and therefore said I, that he taketh of mine and shall declare it unto you. So what he gives you is going to really come from me. But so right here, the Lord, I'm not saying this as an apostle. I'm quoting the Lord. That's how I view this. Any comments there? Any ideas you have?
Yeah, many years ago there was a debate where the proposition was the Matthew 19:9 is New Testament doctrine, and this one guy was on the denial of that. But I mean, here we can see clearly that it indeed is, and from that Jesus guided the Spirit to the apostles, and they were to teach that. Yep. So that's just dumb that what that person held. But that's just me.
Well, I've dealt with some of his views. I know what you're talking about. I've dealt with some of his views in some of my writings. Okay. Now, if you fellas want my notes, my translation notes on Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, and so forth, I'll be happy to send them to you. Okay, and Luke, the passages on marriage, divorce, remarriage, I'll be happy to send them to you.
Please do.
You have my notes on these, on the Romans and 1 Corinthians. I think all of you have those. So, but let's go here. I'll send those to you tonight after class.
Thank you.
Okay. That the wife depart not. And so here's chorizo, to put asunder. It's to put asunder or separate oneself. Now, our problem is we get the idea of separation. It's a legal term in the United States. It's not necessarily a biblical term. Kind of keep that in mind. So we confuse our legal language in our country with the Bible. And we need to be very careful we don't misinterpret the Bible because of that reason. So and it's translated, it carries out it putting asunder as well, or departing from. Moulton claims this word has a passive form, not a middle significant, but a middle significance. That's what he claims on H.K. Moulton, his lexicon, page 441. So he claims it's passive in form, but of course it's aorist passive form, but the nature of it is middle voice. He says significance of it's middle voice. That's his claim. I'm not saying for sure that's true, but here are all the places that word's found, and that will help you to understand how to figure out the meaning of that word. Look at how it's used everywhere. Look at all your lexicons, of course, but then look at, if you got the access to as many sources as possible, try to read how they use it as well. So depart not, and depart is an infinitive. All right, infinitives are negated not by oo, but by may. So that's why we have may here. And so what it's saying here is, it's basically like a commandment. The wife depart not to depart. The wife is not to depart. Now see, the wife is accusative singular, and an infinitive takes its subject in the accusative case. So it is the wife who is not to depart. Does that make sense? Any questions? She is not to depart from her husband. And actually, it's, if you read it, it's from the husband, from husband, and the word article is not there. But prepositions frequently don't require the article to be definite, and we have a bow. It's of course ablative case. From the husband, not to depart. The wife is not to depart from the husband. Now notice here, not to depart is not in the order you normally want to see it. A Greek order doesn't matter except for emphasis. So there is a standard order. Normally you'd have the negative and the infinitive before this, right in here, you'd have it over here. So the fact that it's out of order, it's pretty emphatic. So we see an emphatic, whatever's in the wrong order, not the normal order, is being emphasized. And so the emphasis is not to depart or not to separate. I think it's probably here putting away from her husband. She's not to do this. And it's translated put asunder in Matthew 19:6 and Mark 10:9. It's also found in 1 Corinthians 17, 11, and 15 that we see here. Look at Matthew 19:6. So then they are no more two but one flesh. But therefore God hath put joined asunder, let not man put asunder. But yet he's joined. Again, this tells me that the covenant of marriage is, God is a party to it because he did the joining. I don't believe it's a marriage if God didn't join them. Right? And I don't believe that he joins a woman to a woman or a man to a man, for instance. And they may call it a marriage, legally call it a marriage, but it's not a marriage in God's eyes. Am I making sense what I'm saying? So Abraham Lincoln was claimed, of course, they got all kinds of things he's supposed to have said, but he's supposed to have said that he asked people, if you called a cow's tail a leg, how many legs would she have? Well, people answered, well, 5 legs. He said, no, calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. She still have 4 legs, okay? And of course, that illustrates the point here. Just you call it that doesn't make it true. And that's a good illustration of it. Whether he said it or not, it makes a good illustration of it. So they're no more two but one flesh. So they're united here. Now let me put what God had joined. The word joined is from the same root as we see joined elsewhere but we get an emphatic form here. And so right here, you got to look at two different forms of the word joined in the various passages. This is more emphatic. It's a stronger word for joining, and you find another place or two. So the joining here in Mark 10:9 and Matthew 19:6 are the strong word for joining. He really joined. It's like gluing them together. They're glued together. And so let man, not man, put us under. That's May with the present imperative. Stop putting us under. Stop this thing. The use of may here means that the wise not to have a disposition, because may gets to your heart or disposition. And it's subjective involved the will. Not even to have the intent to do this, right? And don't even have this thought in your mind, right? The passive infinitive, and that's what we have here, if it's passive, is almost a reflexive in force according to a constant tendency to go in according to Robertson, his grammar, big grammar. Let me see here. Word pictures, I have this, and I won't go through it, but A.T. Robertson has some very interesting thoughts here. He is a commentator, I understand, but I think he's got some pretty good thoughts for you to read and see here. I think put us under here is actually divorcing, and I think that's what he's talking about. I don't think it's separation like we think of in the United States with our courts. I think that's a mistake. People use that, well, they're separated. Well, that's a legal term in America, but it's not a biblical term, right? All right, now, I was separated from my first wife for a period of about a month when I went to Russia and preached. But we weren't separated legally in the United States, of course, but I was away from home. She didn't go with me. I'm glad she didn't. It was too hard a situation for her to have gone through. That 40 or 50 below zero where I was. The usage of the perfect tense indicates that they were still married. See, this means that they thought they had divorced by man's laws, their mates, but they had not divorced by God's laws. Let's go back and see this. We can see this perfect tense. And so the wife, right here, there's your perfect tense. All right. All right. You charge, you're not I, but the Lord. And there it is. To the married, it's perfect tense. They have been married and are still married. That's the thrust of the perfect tense. And so that right there tells me that they're not divorced scripturally in God's eyes. And we're talking about God's view, not man's view. That's what's important. How does God view it? That's what we always need to ask ourselves. How does God view this thing? Not how do I view it or how does anybody else view it, but how does God view it? Because that's in the final judgment, it's going to be how God views it. Any questions? All right, let me do this now. And we've gotten beyond the time. Let's finish this verse and call it a night. I'm sorry, I got off too much. Verse 10, my translation, but to the ones having been and still being, and I footnoted that footnote 200 over here, and that this is the thrust of the Greek perfect tense verb. Having been and still being married, I command, yea, not I, but the Lord, that the wife depart not depart, and or send away her husband from her, right? Now, it could be argued that she was just sending him away, driving him out, and which, of course, that certainly could be the case, right? But I think they were divorcing.